And I went to conferences and I to give talks, and people would come up to me at the end of these conferences angry. And this really surprised me because people never came up to me angry at the end of my talks before.
Angry.
Yeah, I try to be inspiring. And it happened over and over again. And I get people, they'd come up to me and they'd say, your talk was great, and I love learning about personal finance, but please stop telling me to find my purpose. I've been searching for my purpose my whole life. I can't find it. It's frustrating. I'm getting anxious. I don't think there is a purpose. And so my brain clicked, and I'm like, there is something here, because everyone tells us purpose is important, and yet I'm hearing purpose is anxiety causing. So I did a deep dive into literature, and I found two things that didn't make sense.
You are listening to The New Man, Beyond the Macho Jerk and the New Age Wimp. Your host is men's coach Tripp Lanier.
Does it feel like your life is on hold until you figure out your purpose? What's the real reason why so many folks are driven to be wealthy? And why do so many, quote, successful people feel burned out and empty? Dr. Jordan Grumet returns to The New Man to discuss what many believe is the key to their fulfillment: purpose. He's got a unique experience of being a doctor who helps people at the end of their lives, and he's also a popular financial podcast host. This means he sees the gap between what is driving so many of us to be wealthy and what really matters. He's written a new book called The Purpose Code that I absolutely love. It strips away the magical thinking BS and drills down to reveal what purpose and meaning really are. The result is a framework we can all use to do more of what we love, spend time with the people we love, and enjoy the precious time we have on this planet. This conversation it just comes up over and over again. I got an email this morning from someone that was like, I think I just need to find my purpose. And then, so there's this thing.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right. And it's such a loaded thing. So I want to just dive in. Why don't we start with this common definition of purpose? Because I think that's where some of us get off track. So let's just talk about the common notion of what purpose is. What have you learned there?
So I think there are a few things. First and foremost, purpose by definition is big and audacious for most people. So it's this thing that we're all searching for, and we either find it and our life is happy and good, or we don't find it and everything is lost. And I think traditionally...
don't screw it up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so we're talking about this really high stakes issue here. And the other thing that we tend to look at purpose by definition is we tend to say it's the why of what we do, right? So it's this guiding principle, this guidepost of why we do what we do. I actually prefer a much different definition.
All right, we'll get into that. But I just want to kind of like lay out, because it seems to inherently create a trap. When it's like we go through these cycles in our lives, or we go through these seasons, and it's like, all right, I need to learn how to survive. I need to learn how to be prosperous. And then it seems like we click into, okay, well, now I need to find my purpose. Does it follow? I've seen that. Do you see that as well? That kind of trajectory?
Very much so. And I think once people get past kind of the basics of, do I have enough money to survive? Do I have shelter? Do I have kind of comfort? The next step is, well, how am I going to prove my worth in this world? And I think that's when people really jump into purpose, and they're like, okay, I've got to do this kind of big thing that proves that I'm worthy, that proves that it's all worthwhile. Again, this idea that the stakes are really high, and I've got to go out there and change the world, have big impact, do these important things. And as opposed to that being freeing and exciting, I think it ends up being really anxiety provoking, because it's really easy to say, I need to go do these big things, but it's really hard to figure out what those things look like in your life. Not only what's achievable, but what lights you up and what feels important, what feels good. And of course, society always steps in and loves to throw all these ideas at us of what purpose should be, usually because they want to make money off us, right? So we've got influencers, marketing, everyone telling us we should have six-pack abs and wear the finest clothes and be traveling to every country in the world and running an 8-figure business. All these influencer society, TikTok, Instagram, they all want to sell us on this often because they want our eyes or they want to sell us on their advertisements.
Okay.
And so that vacuum is filled up by all these really hard things to accomplish.
All right, let's come back because there were some big things. You went right for the jugular there, that this is about, for a lot of us, when we start to tap into purpose, it's largely about self-worth. And I find that this is where it's like I need to be more significant. So I need to find this orienting principle of my life that also validates my importance and my worth. So let's walk through that, because I think this is a blind spot for folks.
So here's the deal. I think to really understand this, you have to understand the difference between meaning and purpose. And we get this wrong, and that's why we struggle with it so much. So meaning is actually how we look at our past, and it's cognitive. It's all about thoughts, and it's all about our past, and it's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so meaning often is a journey to enough. Happy people tend to tell themselves a heroic story where they had this trauma, whether generational or lived. It was really tough. They made it through it. And because of that, they got to the elevated place they are today. At some point, they look back and say, I was enough. And then when they look to the present and future, they're like, I'm going to continue being enough because I was in the past. People who don't have the greatest sense of meaning, unhappy people, tend to tell themselves victim stories. They say, I had this trauma. I was thwarted in doing what I wanted to do. And that's where I am today because I never could quite make it. And so their belief about the present and future is that they're going to be thwarted. They don't feel like they're enough. Here's where it connects to purpose. See, meaning is about the past. Purpose is about the present and future. And it's all about actions. It's about doing those things that fill us up. A lot of people who are suffering with meaning and don't feel they're enough, instead of going back and working on the meaning issue and looking at the narratives of their life, instead they try to jump to purpose, and they try to purpose their way to enough and purpose their way to happiness. And that's where the achievement thing comes in. I don't feel like I'm enough. I don't have a great sense of meaning, but instead of addressing the meaning, I'm going to create this big vision of purpose. And if I achieve it, I'll finally feel good enough. I'll finally feel like I don't have to prove myself. And unfortunately, we know this just doesn't work. How do we know this doesn't work? Well, look at pop culture. I mean, Steve Jobs was a perfect example. This guy created some of the greatest tech out there in the world, made tons and tons of money. But when you saw him out in the real world, he didn't look particularly happy most of the time. He had things to deal with about meaning. He was adopted, and there's that issue of, am I loved or am I not loved? And I think a lot of that really was part of his suffering, but he tried to purpose his way to enough. And no matter how much he achieved, it didn't quite get him there.
Oh boy. Lots to unpack here. Really good stuff. Because this is such a blind spot, because our culture is largely buying into this. I mean, from a very early age, we are striving to be enough. And there's so much to gain by striving to be enough. But if we're not aware of it, we can get on this treadmill and never get there.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work, right? So I think this is really powerful because it helps us to just start to kind of shake that question off. And one of the questions I like to ask is, what if there was nothing to prove? Because that proving is usually, if I could prove this, then I'll be enough. If I prove this, then that person will like me. Or, if I finally perform well enough, or I get enough of these things, or I get those people to like me, then I'll finally be enough. And that can become the purpose of our lives, striving to perform really highly and achieve a lot of things, or to gain a lot of things, have six-pack abs, be really hot, or live in that zip code, or to make sure that these people all adore me. That is the purpose of life for many of us, but it's not fulfilling. And it also doesn't seem like it's. I think that's the point I want to underline, is that so many folks that I talked to was like, I need to find my purpose. Like, you have your purpose. If we look at your choices on a day-to-day basis, you have a purpose to all of them. And I think they may not see that they're striving for this enough thing. That's been the purpose of their life.
Here's the thing. When you actually work on meaning and get to the point where you feel enough, all of a sudden purpose starts feeling really, really abundant because you don't have to prove yourself anymore. And so I like to talk about big P purpose. That's kind of big, audacious purpose. And a lot of us are searching for big, audacious purpose because we don't feel enough. But if you start from feeling enough, all of a sudden it's supposed to being scarce. Purpose becomes really abundant. It is just the actions in present and future that light you up. Nothing more, nothing less. Purpose is all about action, and it's all about present and future. It's doing those things that excite you, regardless of the outcome. Because once you stop having to prove yourself, you can just dig into those everyday activities that fill you. Those things that bring you a sense of flow where you forget what's happening and forget that time is passing and you stop worrying about goals and you're just like, I am in it in the moment. And if you think about it, that's what happiness really starts looking like. It's like, I have the sense of meaning, I feel enough. And now I'm spending my days doing things that deeply light me up that I can be intentional about. That's where people really start feeling happy. And if you look at our, from when we were born to when we die, a lot of times when we're really young, when we're really, really young, we actually do a lot of that purposeful stuff where we get into flow that excites us. We go play cops and robbers or get involved in a sport. When we're really young, we're allowed to do that. But at some point, everything flips and we get serious and we have to go to school and we have to build a career. But I'd say from about our 20s to the day we die, your main goal in life is to actually build more of that abundant purpose into your life, have more of that flow, and get rid of things you don't like doing. And so we constantly want to be looking at our life over the months and years, realizing that time is finite, and slowly improving that calculus of I'm doing more things that are abundant, that are intentional, that are exciting, that get me to that flow space, and I'm doing less things that I loathe. And the only way to really do that is once you feel enough to start figuring out what really does light you up, as opposed to constantly being on that treadmill of, can I prove myself? Can I prove myself? Can I prove myself? Which, as we know, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, I mean, you can see tons of these people out there. They're achieving tons. But most of us would look at them and say, yeah, they don't look particularly happy.
Yeah. I don't, let's bring this down to earth because you described an episode of my life after I was fortunate enough to sell my first company when I was young. I didn't have enough money to retire. I had enough money for a few years. And internally, I felt called to become a coach. Like the thing I enjoyed so much was having these deep, impactful conversations and essentially helping people create great things in their lives. And I was like, holy shit, that sounds amazing. I want to do that. However, there was another part of me that was like, oh, come on, you got to go big. You got to do something impressive. Yeah. Like you can't, that's a step backwards. Like your previous business, you didn't have to show up to the office at certain times and you should be able to scale a thing. I had all of these rules in my head about what a business person was, quote, supposed to do. And being a coach was at odds with that. And I circled the drain for a few years fighting this, like, I need to find something else. I need to find something else. When the reality it was staring me in the face the whole time was, I love having these conversations and that's how I want to spend my time. But there was this other part of me. I was like, yeah, that's not enough. Like, that's not impressive. That's not cool. And it held me back for a long time until I just started to turn into the things that I really enjoyed doing and said, fuck it. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life, or until I find the next thing, I should say. So I want to underline that because I could see where someone would think that what lights them up is wrong. And it was fortunate for me that I could earn a living doing it. I think there's another part of this conversation where we could take the pressure off of the finances to do it. But I wanted to just bring that story in there because I think a lot of us are not able to make this equation work because it needs to be big or impressive.
And I think here's the big question. Why did you think that this thing that lit you up wasn't enough? And there are one of two answers. Either one was what you're really saying is, I'm not enough, and doing this thing doesn't sound important enough to convince me that I'm enough. That's one possibility. Again, that comes back to meaning. Mm-hmm. Or the other possibility is we've all been somewhat brainwashed by our world and social media and Instagram and TikTok and even our parents that have this idea of what purpose should look like in our life. And we tend to co-opt it, right? So when we're seeing all these images from marketers of driving the nice car and having the money and having the hot spouse and all those kind of things that are sold to us, the problem is they're not selling them to us because they want us to do these things to be happy. They're selling them to us because they want us to buy whatever product or whatever thing they're selling. But it's really hard after we've been brainwashed for all these years with all these images that constantly are coming at us through our phones and TVs to all of a sudden say, yeah, I've been told that that's what purpose looks like. I've been told that that's what the good life looks like. But you know, this thing over here that no one ever talks about that you never see on TV that's glamorous, that thing fills me up. And so it takes a lot of courage to be able to walk away from the vision to get to the reality. But one size doesn't fit all. We know this. Not everyone is going to be happy traveling every country. Not everyone's going to be happy running an 8-figure business if they can, which is a whole nother question.
Right.
Not everyone is going to be happy having 6-pack abs if they can, because not everyone has those genetics. Not everyone has that time. Not everyone has that inclination or the stamina to work out the way you need to do that. So it really gets us off track. There are all these kind of things that are building up purpose to be big and difficult, and we fall for it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, it's a theory that if I have this grandiose thing and it's also outcome oriented. I'm gonna do ABC. I'm gonna accomplish ABC. It's very much achiever usually. If I do this thing, then I've achieved my purpose in life, and it's like, okay, then what, right? But you're underlining that no, purpose is the activity, it's the action, it's the thing we're leaning into, it's the process that we're leaning into, and that's what gives us a sense of purpose, not just this. Because there's so many guys that are sitting around twiddling their thumbs like, I'm waiting to find my purpose. They're waiting for this grandiose vision to come along that's important and it aligns with their self-image. And then they're thinking, okay, then I can begin my life. A lot of us are waiting to begin our lives because we're waiting for that grandiose version instead of sniffing around and experimenting and trying things and seeing where we find more energy, more aliveness.
And look, this has actually been studied because ultimately I think the end goal is some version of happiness or contentment or fulfillment or self-actualization. I don't want to get into what we want to call those things, but all of us have that end goal of getting to that place that feels good. Well, it's been studied. Harvard Adult Developmental Health Study started in the early 1900s, studied originally about 1,000 Harvard students, then started with their family members, then a bunch of controls out of Boston. They interviewed these people every 2 years. As technology improved, they started doing blood tests, MRIs, EEGs, interviewing their family members, studied these people for 80 years.
Wow.
And they asked one basic question, or one of many questions, but a big one was, what causes people to be happy? And guess what their answer showed? It wasn't money. And there are all sorts of studies about money and happiness, and we can go into those. But the best study, the Harvard Developmental Health Study, showed it wasn't money, wasn't career, wasn't achievements. It wasn't even purpose per se, and we'll come back to this in a moment. What they found truly makes people happy is interpersonal connections. It's the connections in the community. Now, my argument in my book, and what I'll tell you about purpose, is I think if we practice purpose correctly, it just becomes a conduit to connecting with other people.
Yeah.
When we actually pursue the kind of purpose that lights us up, people are attracted to us like a moth to the flame. They see our light and they want to collaborate or work with us or learn from us. And we then build communities. And I think ultimately that's where we end up, how we get to happiness, is we use purpose as a conduit to communities and connections, which ultimately leads to a satisfying, fulfilling life. Has nothing to do with how much money you make, has nothing to do with what title you have next to your name, has nothing to do with so-called impact and legacy that we're all worried that if we don't change the world in some major way, that once we die, we'll be gone. Interpersonal connections through what I believe is just basic process-oriented purpose.
All right, you talked about studies, but I have always appreciated your perspective because of your experience as a hospice doctor, helping people at the end of their lives. You interview them, you go through the life review. You have had a front row seat with people who are reviewing their lives and essentially downloading, like, here's what I learned, here's what was great, here's what was not so great. And I think about this story. I think his name was Ricky in the book. And I wonder if you could just like, yeah, there's the studies, but then I always like, okay, tell us about Ricky. Because he seemed to kind of fulfill this path that all of us are programmed to believe that we should want, and it will kind of prove that we're enough. But what happened with Ricky?
So Ricky struggled to get into law school. Once he was in, he wanted to be in a huge Big Five law firm, didn't make it. Ultimately, he had to start his own law firm, built it up bigger, higher, more and more income. Got to the point where they were one of the most successful law firms in the Chicagoland area, and eventually got sick and was dying. And even on his deathbed, was sitting there trying to top himself. He wanted to make sure he could sell his law firm to the highest bidder and have it be the biggest sale of a law firm that the city had ever seen. And the problem was, none of it made him particularly happy. He was always continually striving towards the next thing. He was trying to fill that hole of enoughness, and it never worked. And so again, this is arguably one of the most successful guys out there, did everything he needed to do to get to the next level. But he found that every time he reached one of those achievements, he found a bit of emptiness. He was following a script that had been written for him as opposed to his own script. And as he got closer to death, he realized that there were probably lots of other things that were deeply important to him that he had always been putting off in order just to fulfill this mandate to prove that he was good enough. It started in barely getting into law school and then not getting into a big firm. All these voices kept telling him he wasn't good enough, or so he thought. So he had to keep proving himself. But ultimately, the message about being good enough actually came from him in the first place. And so I think this happens to people all the time. It might be money, it might be career. Whatever we kind of set our brain to, we really have to ask our question, is this thing filling us up? Not the goal, because a lot of times we spend 95 to 99% in the process, and we only reach the goal for a short period of time. And what we find is we hedonically adapt, right? Even if you do the most amazing thing in the world, that happiness only lasts for so long and you fall to your baseline. So if you're spending all your time doing something you don't enjoy in order to reach a goal that you dream about, but the happiness, even if you reach that goal, only lasts for a short period of time, you're spending a lot of time in process, and you're spending a lot of time doing things you loathe or at least don't enjoy in service of a goal that's fleeting. And so I think Ricky very much had this series of fleeting goals that he kept on convincing himself would be enough, and it never was.
Is there some point? I mean, I talk to a lot of guys that reach this point in their lives, and they start to wake up. Doesn't sound like Ricky got the message, but a lot of folks do. They say, hey, this isn't working. I can't see myself doing this another 20 years, much less another 5. Whatever path I'm on, this isn't working for me. It's burning me out. It's eating me up. The wins are empty. So this is a very common place for me to start to meet people at that stage in life, but they're not quite in tune yet that most of what is driving them is this need to prove that they're enough. And I wonder how much do we need to understand that in order to shift lanes into this other kind of purpose? Otherwise, because if it's like that not enough thing, we're never going to fill that. Like, that's never going to be completely happy and completely content, because it's just a bottomless pit. That's my experience of it. Like, it obviously with Ricky, it never got to be enough for him. So I wonder how do we shift that lane? What's your take on that?
So first and foremost, I agree with you 100% that the end game is burnout, which is exactly what happens. You either burn out because you set a goal that's too high and you can't reach it, or you hit burnout because you reach the goal and then double down and are already to the next goal, but finding again those activities aren't fulfilling you. Getting to enough is hard, especially if you've spent your whole life telling yourself these stories, writing these narratives in which you weren't enough. And so, correct, I think it is a bottomless well. On the other hand, there's something called neuroplasticity, right? So if you've been telling yourself these stories for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, they imprint on your brain. And they affect how you see the present and future, which again is about purpose and eventually about whether we're happy or not. So I think we have to undo some of that neuroplasticity. And so while there's no perfect, I think there's some things we can start doing to address meaning, which is something called narrative therapy. When you go back and you actually write better stories about your past that separate you from the trauma and the bad things that happened to you, so you can realize that you were a good person in a bad situation instead of a bad person. And so you're starting to build that hero narrative where you take a more objective look from the outside, say, hey, I was doing the best I could and look how far I've still come. So creating a better narrative, I think things like affirmations, visualization, I think especially for a lot of people, it's realizing that I love to call those narratives demons. And so we all have that demon sitting on our shoulder that's going to try to dissuade us when we start to go for things we really want or really love, but that they don't reach that, height of achievement or what we're trying to prove is enough. So I think there are these things we can do. But the beauty is you don't have to get 100% there, but you do need a better sense of meaning because it's really hard to pursue purpose if you don't start working on meaning. So if you're constantly struggling on enough, jumping to purpose kind of short circuits you. And so I think we have to start thinking about meaning, and I think we have to start thinking about that neuroplasticity and rewriting those narratives, changing our brains with things like narrative therapy and affirmations and visualization. And I think once we start that process, we can then much more joyfully jump into purpose, which is going to feel odd for the hyperachiever, right? It's going to feel odd for Tripp 10 or 15 years ago to say, I've built these businesses, I've made all this money. And instead of building this really huge scalable business, I'm actually going to do coaching, which is just something that lights me up and I enjoy the process of doing. But my bet is once you started doing that, that neuroplasticity kicked in and you started changing your brain. And where it felt very odd in the beginning, over time, as you got engaged in those activities that light you up and you started connecting with people who needed your help or wanted to teach you or wanted to be involved in your community, my bet is those narratives started changing and you started telling yourself a very different narrative, which is, this is my inner gift. This is my light. And this is how I bring my light to the world. And yes, it may never create an 8-figure business, but living within that light actually feels much more fulfilling moment to moment and day to day than struggling and burning out just to get to this one goal, whether it be an 8-figure business or being a billionaire or whatever it is. It feels much better to spend your days doing these things that light you up as opposed to just working towards a goal that may or may not light you up.
Yeah, agreed. And one of the things that I notice within myself and also with working with people is like, expect the tension. Expect the tension of, I'm going to do this thing that lights me up, that feels more aligned with my values, and then expect there to be tension with the shiny, but you should be going big, and those guys are doing X, Y, and Z, and learning to essentially develop kind of an inner guidance system, but also just like, where do I actually just feel more whole and more of myself and more at peace with myself, even though there's a bit of tension. These folks are doing X, Y, Z, but that's not really for me. Where do I feel more aligned and more whole? And I find that just kind of having more of a vocabulary around these experiences helps us see like, no, this is what I really want. This is what I really appreciate. And there might be some friction from time to time that I'm missing out or I'm doing X, Y, Z, but it ultimately it comes back to like, no, there's a sense of peace that this is what's for me and this is where I actually feel more of myself. But I wouldn't want to paint the picture that somehow somebody's going to get on this path and then there won't be any more. I think so many of us are just looking for this escape. I'm done. I'm set once and for all. Like I got on my purpose now and there's no more tension and there's no more work or whatever. It's like, no, that's bullshit. It's still really challenging. And one of the challenges might be wrestling with that self-image that still believes it needs to be, grandiose and big in that regard.
I can't remember, Tripp, if I read it in your book or maybe from Brian Johnson Heroic, but one of you guys put it very cleanly and it made so much sense to me. You kind of said, if you want something different, you got to do something different. And if you're going to do something different, you're going to step out of your comfort zone. And stepping out of your comfort zone always feels uncomfortable. And so this idea that changing our lives and pursuing a much more fulfilling life is just going to be easy and natural and comfortably fit from day one, it's a myth, right? This stuff is hard. And I really remind people, and this is the big thing about purpose, because I think most people think that purpose is supposed to just fall into your lap. And again, either it falls into your lap and you live the best life ever, or it doesn't fall into your lap and you miss everything. I'd like to dissuade people from this idea. I don't think you find purpose. I think you build and create purpose, which means it is action oriented, and action isn't easy, right? Taking actions, being different, doing something different for a different outcome takes energy and is stressful and is going to make you feel uncomfortable at times. But that doesn't also mean that it isn't abundant and out there for you to grab. It just becomes much more of a personal decision. And this is what I love: personal decision agency. The way a lot of people look at purpose is either it happens to you or it doesn't happen to you. There's a real lack of agency there. And what I'd like to convince people is, yes, taking action is hard, but you have agency over taking that action or not. And so now you have the decision, am I going to build this life or not?
Yeah. So many of us are sitting back waiting for the perfect plan. We don't want to experiment. We don't want to take action. I can raise my hand that was what was happening at that period of my life as well. It's so common. And most of the time when I talk to guys, I'm like, what would make you happy? Is I need to find my vision. I need to find the plan. And it's like, okay, no, we find it by doing. We find it by engaging. We've got a flashlight. I don't know who came up with this metaphor. We can only see about 20 yards ahead, and that's it. But we're going to go into the darkness, and we're going to continue to find it and build it as we go. And you get more clarity as you go, but you can't sit back and plan it. You get this grand vision of like, here's what my life's going to be, and now I can finally start doing it. And once I, at that period of my life, let go of waiting for this grand strategy and plan and perfectness to show up, then it was just, okay, what's the next step? What's the next step? What's the next step? And a lot of times the things that I was doing, some of them were cool. Some of them weren't. Some of them were like, yes, this, and do more of this. But there was always this thing in my brain. It's like, well, how's this going to make me important? How's this going to make me a shitload of money? How's this going to satisfy? I was like, I don't know. It may not. But this is where I feel more aligned. This is where I feel more whole. Let's keep going. And then looking back in the rearview mirror, all those dots connect, where at the time, it just didn't seem like I couldn't see how those dots were connecting. But then looking back, it's like, yeah, all those dots connected. And there was a purpose to that. There was some kind of underlying theme to all of those things. But I couldn't predict it ahead of time. There was no vision for that.
Here's the interesting thing. I always tell people, like, again, you don't find purpose, you build or create it. But it is true. We need to understand what some of the inklings or beckonings are that we want to build a life of purpose around. Like, what is kind of exciting to us? I call those purpose anchors. And in the book, I talk a lot about how you find your purpose anchors. But here's the point I want people to really know. The purpose anchors don't really matter that much, other than they're just a clue of a direction you should take. What matters is the building and the creating that you do around those purpose anchors. And so I do work with a lot of coaching clients where we spend some time building out their purpose anchors. And they always think they're going to have none. And then they end up with 15 or 20 or 30 things that excite them. And then the next question is, oh my God, there's too much. How could I pick? And my answer is, take a dart and throw it against dartboard and pick 2 or 3. And it doesn't even matter what they are. The magic is the building and creating. And so for all those people stuck, and I know you get these coaching clients a lot too, where they're like, oh my God, I need to do this big thing. Where do I start? Again, I'd like to take the stress and the stakes down and say, it doesn't even matter where you start. It's what you're going to do once you stick to something. It's that building and creating, which is where the magic happens. And if I could convince them of that, I can also often convince them that it's fine to have goals, but you have to be a touch more goal agnostic. Like, it's great. You want to build this thing. You're passionate about this idea, so you're going to build a company around it. It is fine if you want this to be a 6-figure, 7-figure business. But if you find yourself doing things that don't light you up and that you loathe in service of that goal, then you've kind of lost the game.
Yeah, you lost the plot for sure.
Yeah.
I always like to say that the job of this step is to find the next step.
Yeah.
Like you
Because it's
engage the
building.
process and it's like, okay, I got some information. Oh, and that's directing me to this step. Let's go there.
Because
That's really hard for that part of us that wants
because
certainty and safety. And it just has to, we need to know it's all going to work out before we go out there. But it's kind of like walking out onto an icy lake. Like just take it once, just slowly ease on out there. And most of the time we're totally fine. But it's just that willingness to keep going. I see so many people make the mistakes of like, yeah, I did 2 steps and it didn't, all of a sudden my vision didn't appear. So I stopped and it was like, oh, you got to keep going.
and what I love about that is it's action, right? We talk about momentum, right? In business circles, we
Mm,
talk about momentum, but purpose is all about the present and future, and it's about action. And what if you could do these actions that were exciting and lit you up, and you stopped caring about proving yourself with them? You stopped caring about proving you were enough, and you just did these things. And guess what? If it doesn't work, you just do something different.
yeah.
You try something different. You engage with different people. You try a different method. You decide, hey, this inkling, this beckoning, this purpose anchor I thought was going to light me up, it isn't. No big deal.
Yeah.
Throw that one away. Let's start on a different one. Let's climb a different mountain. But again, it's action. And I think if we can really focus on that, purpose and action are so tied together, whereas meaning and thoughts are so tied together.
Mm. Yeah, it requires us to get uncomfortable. It requires us to lean into uncertainty, and it requires us to get over ourselves. Those are three themes that I come up against quite a bit. So, all right. Well, obviously, there's some reason why you wrote this book. So, tell us about your story. How did you end up here, and so engaged in purpose, and in your own life, reached this point where this is what's purposeful for you?
So I made the classic mistake, right? So I had trauma when I was little. My dad died when I was 7. He was a doctor. I thought I could cosmically fix the world by co-opting his sense of purpose and by becoming a doctor too. And my family loved it and everything was great. And I had a learning disability at the time, which I got over. I went to medical school, residency, started practicing, and burnt out, because what happens when you're doing things that you don't love the process of doing in order to fulfill a goal? My goal was to fix my father's death, which obviously I never was going to do. So I burned out. And
I
at
mean,
some
now, were
point,
you aware of this, that this was going on, or did this occur to you later that this was what you were doing?
I think the awareness came slowly over time. I think there
Okay.
was a time, even when I was practicing, where I'm like, I am not my father. And I remember my mom gave me a bunch of his old stuff, right? Because he died when I was 7 and she had kept a bunch of his notebooks. And I started opening them up and he had taken notes from medical lectures and it was all detailed. And you could see the love and the excitement about the basic science. And I'm like, I had none of that.
That's not me.
Like I was doing this because I had this goal, and so I had to figure out what I needed to know, et cetera. Now, don't get me wrong. There were some parts about being a doctor that I really loved. But I got to this point, I burned out. I happened to be lucky enough to find the personal finance space and learn about financial independence. I realized that I probably had enough money that I could pull away from this thing that was burning me out. It took me years to have the courage to do that.
What was scary then for you? What
Oh
was
my
scary?
God, to walk away from the identity of being a doctor. And the only wisp of connection I had with my father was incredibly difficult.
Okay, so there's
But
like a shaking of that self-image and that identity.
Yeah,
Who am I if I'm not a doctor and I'm not, you know?
totally.
Okay.
And what does purpose look like? This whole thing that was supposed to be purpose, my whole life, like I was set from the age of 7. I had that thing that everyone strives for, can't find, and gets anxious about. I had it already.
It was your dad's, but you had one.
But it felt like, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, during those periods where I needed it as a little kid, it really did. I mean, like
Mm.
it actually felt a lot like purpose. It was very process oriented at the time. It was exciting. It was joyful. But ultimately, I realized that I had taken my father's version of purpose. And ultimately, I did have a big goal. And that was to fix my father's death. And at some point, I
Mm.
realized it didn't. It took me a while to get out of medicine. As I got rid of things I didn't like in medicine, the having my own practice and being on call and the long hours, the one thing I still loved was I spent a few hours each week working with hospice patients as a hospice medical director, and I really loved that. So I knew I wanted to keep that, but that opened up all my time to start doing things I really wanted to try. And I always knew I loved writing and I loved communicating. And so I started a blog and a podcast about personal finance. But interestingly enough, how I got to purpose was when I was podcasting about personal finance and I was interviewing these authors, these 8-figure business people, these financial independence gurus. A lot of times when we get to things like, well, what is enough money? When are you going to stop? And why are you doing all this? I would get a lot of blank stares.
Mm.
And so I realized that these people could wonderfully tell me how to accumulate wealth, but they had a harder time telling me the why behind it all. But strangely enough, you know who could tell me a lot about why? My dying hospice patients. When they were on their deathbeds, they wanted to talk about all the things they regretted, and they never talked about making more money, and they never talked about working more nights and weekends. They talked about not having the energy, courage, or time to do the things that were most important to them. So I wanted to bring that conversation to the personal finance world. I eventually wrote a book called Taking Stock, which was exactly about that. And a main premise of that book was that we should take purpose and put that first and build a financial framework around it. So I went to market this book and I went to conferences and I to give talks, and people would come up to me at the end of these conferences angry. And this really surprised me because people never came up to me angry at the end of my talks before.
Angry.
Yeah, I try to be inspiring. And it happened over and over again. And I'd get people, they'd come up to me and they'd say, you know, your talk was great, and I love learning about personal finance, but please stop telling me to find my purpose. I've been searching for my purpose my whole life. I can't find it. It's frustrating. I'm getting anxious. I don't think there is a purpose. And so my brain clicked, and I'm like, there is something here, because everyone tells us purpose is important, and yet I'm hearing purpose is anxiety causing. So I did a deep dive into literature, and I found two things that didn't make sense. The first was that all the studies, tons of studies, show that purpose is associated with health, longevity, and happiness. Tons of great studies that show this. But then I found other studies that show that up to 91% of people at some point in their life have purpose anxiety, this idea that purpose actually makes them feel frustrated and depressed and anxious. So that was a paradox. And so I really looked at all my experience, that of being an author, that of running a mastermind, of doing personal coaching, of being a hospice doctor, of doing a podcast and interviewing some of the most amazing people in the world. And the conclusion I came up to is that we just fundamentally get purpose wrong, that it's probably not one thing, but probably two. And one of those is more associated with anxiety, what I call big P purpose. And the other is probably more associated with all those good things like health, happiness, and longevity. And that's little p purpose. And the crux of the difference is what we've been talking about here is process-oriented purpose, letting go of some of those big, audacious goals and diving in and digging into those actions that fill us up.
Beautiful. Well, I'm grateful you're doing this work. All right. Is there some action that we could leave our listener with today that might help them start to tap into or help them start to realize this healthy small p purpose, as you call it?
I think we need to let go of everything society sells us on and really think about what lights us up. As a kid, as an adult, when are those times that we're most happy? And then we got to start thinking about how could we actually build a life of purpose around those type of things. Doesn't mean leaving your job. It doesn't mean living super frugal. It doesn't mean not pursuing goals, but it means being much more thoughtful about how to bring more of those purposeful activities into our lives.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that you added that caveat there, because somehow finances just get intertwined in this conversation. I always look at it as like, no, have your finances support your ability to do purposeful activities and live a purposeful life. It's not, everybody puts the job front and center instead of having the purpose be front and center, and allowing and having the job empower that, have our relationships empower that. I think it's so important to switch that priority that you pointed out.
Yeah, money is a fantastic tool used to help you build a life of purpose, but it is not the only tool. And that's where people make the mistake. So when you're 22 and you're working 50 hours a week and you don't like your job, and you look up at me and say, well, you're kind of privileged and have lots of money. Of course, you could pursue your purpose, but I'm just trying to put food on the table. I would say that's true. You don't have a huge amount of that tool of money, but you're 22, which means you probably have a lot more energy and time than I have. You don't have a mortgage. You don't have kids. There are lots of things you don't have. How can you start building purposeful activities in some of your free time, even if you're not changing that 8 to 6 job? But how are we trading out some of that downtime or that time we don't love and filling it with things we do love? And my bet is, even at a young age, if you start building more of that into your life, it will turn into opportunities. It will turn into a changing career. It will turn into many good things.
Yeah.
Connections, community. But you got to start figuring out what feels like purpose to you and diving in.
Think about that. It's like, I'm going to go build a life that is built around shit that drains me. And those people will be the people that I associate with from that are going to be those people. It's like, that's not my community. I'm never going to feel at home there. But if I build a life around the things that have me feel more alive and I meet people through that, that's my tribe. Those are my people. This is where I feel at home. Everything stems from that. It's so, so important.
And I do believe, although I never bet on this and I never guarantee it to people, but I do believe if you do more things that truly light you up, eventually that will turn into revenue streams. It's not guaranteed, but I think it's a good place to start. And if it doesn't turn into revenue streams, you're still better off for doing purposeful activities that light you up. But especially if you start young, my suspicion is you will find a way to integrate those different parts of your lives so you can start minimizing that time you loathe, right? We don't want to be doing stuff that sucks the life out of us. Yes, sometimes, especially at the beginning of a career, you start there, but that doesn't mean that you can't continuously be improving.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the more that we fill ourselves up with the stuff that aligns with us and feeds us, the less we feel like we need all of that other shit that just drains us. And it's this like eating junk food, trying to get nourishment and nutrition. It's like, well, if we eat nourishing foods, we don't have to eat as much. Essentially, I always like that metaphor too. So, all right, Jordan, thank you so much, man. It's always great to connect with you. I love that you're bringing this to the world. This is so needed. It's so important. There's so much misery and greed and workaholism that is stemming from this unhealthy association with purpose, and we need more voices like yours out here trumpeting what real purpose is about.
Thank you so much for having me for this great conversation.
If these interviews are helping you, please leave a positive review on whatever podcast app you use so that others can discover the show more easily.